Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. The Bible tells one big story of redemption, and we want to spend 5 minutes every day journeying through the Bible from start to finish and exploring how all of it points to Jesus.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Stephanie and I will be your host through the book of Ezra. Today we are covering chapters 4, 5, and 6. Yesterday we read in chapter 3 that the first wave of Israelites returned to Jerusalem to begin rebuilding the temple. God preserved a remnant or a group of Israelites, and he made a way for them to return to the land he had promised them. In chapter 4, we read about the resistance they faced. It's interesting though. They're called adversaries of Judah and Benjamin in verse 1. But in the following verse, we hear them speak with a kind front as they say, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do." That sounds confusing and conflicting. What's going on? These were actually enemies of Israel. They were Samaritans who were a mixed race people. They had intermarried with some Jewish women who were left behind from the deportation. Their form of worship was actually idolatry, and so we see God's people refuse their help. In response, the opposition's true colors appear. They discourage the rebuild, make them afraid, and bribe counselors to frustrate their aim of rebuilding the temple. The following verses continue to expound on the opposition they faced during the time of resettlement. The Samaritans were adamantly opposed to the Jews. They wrote a letter to the king calling Jerusalem a rebellious city prone to sedition or rebellion against the king. They accused the Jews of not paying taxes. In turn, the king puts forth a decree to stop the rebuild. For 16 years, God's people are forced to press pause on rebuilding the temple. While God's people were discouraged by this opposition, God was not surprised. He was sovereign over every part of the journey, including the opposition. As the rebuilding of the temple picks back up, we see God use prophets like Haggai and Zechariah to encourage and support the people. They help them trust in God's faithful hand and continue the rebuilding with renewed zeal. But the opposition continues, and we read about it in chapter 5. We read that an official search was initiated to find the original decree from King Cyrus that allowed the return and rebuilding in the first place. In chapter 6, we read that the royal archives are searched, and it is indeed found that Cyrus not only approved of the rebuilding, but also offered the means to build a bigger and better temple. In light of this, we read King Darius's response. The work on this house of God is to be left alone. They were not to hinder the rebuilding. Not only that, a decree is set forth that the cost is to be paid from the royal revenue. If anyone attempted to alter the edict, they were to be punished by death. It's clear that God's favor was on his people. We are reminded that God is true to his word, and his plans can never be thwarted by man. Ultimately, it was the decree of God that ensured the rebuilding and reestablishment of God's people in the land. So chapter 6 ends with the temple being finished and rededicated to the Lord. There is the celebration of the Passover feast to the Lord. Note verse 21. The feast was eaten by the people of Israel who had returned from exile and also by everyone who had joined them and separated himself from the uncleanness of the people of the land to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. The Israelites didn't observe Passover alone. Believing Gentiles who followed Yahweh joined the people of God to worship God. What a beautiful picture of the family of God. What we're seeing here is the Old Testament declaring the truths of the New Testament. God's people are brought together from every tribe, every tongue, and every nation to worship God. God's mission has always been a global mission. These chapters also remind us of another reality. Until Jesus returns, God's people will experience tension. To varying degrees, we will receive opposition. Persecution is a real thing. But through it all, we can trust that God will remain faithful and that no plan of his will be thwarted. Just as God preserved his people, he will preserve those of us in Jesus Christ. The ending we see today is a glimpse of what is to come, the fullness of joy in his presence, leading to corporate worship of all God's people. That concludes today's reading. Be sure to follow us on Instagram @Daily Grace Podcasts and check back tomorrow as we finish out the book of Ezra.